The shocking truth about storage treasures. They completely lost their composure. When they saw this, they had opened dozens of storage units before. Most of them ended the same way: disappointment, dust, and hours of sorting through items barely worth the effort. So when they won this container for a modest price, expectations were low. From the doorway, it looked ordinary. Second-hand furniture, old boxes, random household clutter stacked without order. The smell of humidity and time hung in the air, the familiar scent of abandoned belongings. They started unloading methodically, piece by piece, building small piles outside the unit. Nothing unusual, nothing valuable, until they reached the back. Behind a broken wardrobe and several trash bags sat 3 identical black plastic containers sealed with layers of industrial tape. The placement felt intentional, almost concealed. One of them tried to lift the first container. It barely moved. That's when curiosity turned into focus. They cut through the tape slowly, expecting tools, maybe equipment, something heavy but explainable. The lid came off. Inside were vacuum-sealed bricks wrapped in opaque plastic. For a second, the brain refused to interpret what the eyes were seeing. Then realization hit. Cash. Stacks of tightly compressed currency, perfectly organized, filling the entire container from bottom to top. No one spoke. One of them exhaled sharply, almost like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. Another started laughing, not from humor, but from shock, the nervous system trying to cope with something completely unexpected. They opened the second container. More cash. The third. Even more. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Adrenaline surged. Hands trembled. Thoughts spiraled into impossible scenarios. Debts erased. Lives changed overnight. Problems solved in seconds. For a brief moment, rational thinking disappeared. But then something changed. At the bottom of the last container were sealed envelopes and folders. Inside were photographs, addresses, names, dates written in marker, and one photo of the exact storage unit they were standing in, taken before the auction ever happened. The emotional high collapsed into a heavy silence. Because suddenly this wasn't a lucky discovery. It was a situation. They realized something most people never consider. When valuables appear in storage units, ownership isn't always straightforward. Legal claims, investigations, disputes, any of these could follow. The excitement that had overwhelmed them minutes earlier was replaced by caution. Their breathing slowed, their thoughts returned, and the truth settled in. The biggest storage treasures don't just test luck, they test judgment. Some containers hold forgotten belongings, others hold stories you were never meant to enter. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The containers were still open, the money still inside. But the emotional state had changed completely. The rush of excitement was gone, replaced by something heavier: awareness. One of them finally spoke, quietly. This wasn't forgotten. And that was the moment everything became real. They started examining the documents more carefully. The folders weren't random. Each envelope had labels, dates going back years, notes written in different handwriting styles. Some pages contained transaction numbers. Others had printed photographs of locations, parking lots, buildings, storage facilities. This wasn't someone hiding personal savings. It looked organized, deliberate, professional. The kind of organization that suggested planning, not accident. Their minds began to race again, but now in a different direction. Questions replaced fantasies. What if someone comes looking for this? What if this is connected to something illegal? What are you even supposed to do in a situation like this? The psychological contrast was intense. Minutes earlier, they had imagined freedom. Now they were calculating risk. One of them checked the inside of the container lid. That's when they saw it. A small rectangular device taped under the plastic rim. A tracker. No lights. No sound. But unmistakable. For a second, panic surged through both of them. Not loud panic, the quiet kind that tightens your chest and sharpens your senses. Suddenly, every noise in the facility felt louder. Every distant door slam felt closer. They stepped back instinctively, because the realization hit all at once. If there was a tracker, someone cared about where this was. And if someone cared, someone might come. They closed the containers slowly, almost respectfully, as if trying not to disturb something dangerous. The excitement of discovery had completely transformed into caution. In the world of storage auctions, people talk about jackpots, units filled with antiques, collectibles, rare items worth thousands. But moments like this reveal a different reality. Sometimes the most shocking discoveries aren't valuable because of what they are. They're shocking because of what they mean. They locked the unit again before leaving that night. Neither of them spoke much on the drive home. Both understood the same thing without saying it. They hadn't just opened a container. They had stepped into someone else's hidden story. And once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. The next morning felt unreal. Sleep had been shallow, fragmented, minds replaying the discovery over and over. Every detail sharpened in memory. The weight of the containers, the texture of the sealed packages, the cold realization when they saw the tracker. What had felt like opportunity now felt like responsibility. They returned to the facility early, before most renters arrived. The corridor was quiet, fluorescent lights humming overhead, rows of metal doors stretching into the distance like identical vaults. For a moment they just stood there, outside the unit, neither eager to open it again. When the door finally rolled up, nothing had changed, but everything felt different. The containers sat exactly where they had left them, silent and heavy, holding the same unanswered questions. They began documenting everything, photos, videos, inventory lists, not because they wanted to, but because they understood the situation had crossed into territory far beyond a normal storage auction find. Large, unexplained cache discoveries could involve legal reporting requirements, potential ownership disputes, even investigations. The reality was simple. This wasn't just property anymore. It was evidence of something unknown. As they continued searching the unit, more details emerged. Additional paperwork, hidden inside furniture drawers. A notebook containing dates and numbers written in sequences. Receipts from multiple cities, different states. The pattern suggested movement, transportation, coordination over time. One of them noticed something else. Dust outlines on the floor where other containers had once been. Rectangular shapes slightly cleaner than the surrounding concrete. Meaning what they found might only be part of what had once been there. That realization carried its own weight. Someone had already removed something, or planned to. Hours passed. The emotional intensity faded into a quiet, analytical focus. Adrenaline had been replaced by caution, procedure, and the awareness that whatever decision they made next could have consequences. Because the truth about storage units is rarely dramatic in the way people imagine. It's not just about finding treasure. It's about encountering fragments of real lives, sometimes messy, sometimes tragic, sometimes secret. Before closing the unit again, one of them looked back at the containers. Just hours earlier, they had represented the possibility of instant transformation. Now they represented uncertainty, risk, and a story they didn't fully understand. They shut the metal door. The sound echoed down the corridor, final, heavy, unforgettable. And both of them knew one thing with absolute certainty. Some discoveries don't feel like winning. They feel like crossing a line you didn't know existed. The days that followed were filled with tension. On the surface, life continued normally. Phone calls, routine work, small conversations that had nothing to do with what they had found. But internally, both of them carried the same constant awareness. Somewhere, there was a story connected to that container, and they were now part of it. They began researching quietly. Storage auction laws, reporting obligations, cases where buyers had discovered large sums of money. The more they learned, the clearer one reality became. Situations like this rarely end simply. Ownership could be disputed. Authorities could become involved. Original renters could attempt to reclaim property. And if the contents were connected to illegal activity, the complications multiplied. The excitement people imagine when finding treasure was nowhere to be found anymore. Only calculation. At one point, one of them asked a question neither had wanted to say out loud. What if someone comes looking for it? The silence that followed was enough, because the existence of the tracker meant one thing. Whoever placed those containers there had intended to monitor them at some point. Whether the device was still active didn't matter. The intention had existed. That realization changed how they viewed the entire situation. The container wasn't just storage space. It had been a temporary hiding place. And temporary implies a plan to return. A week later, when they visited the facility again, something small but unsettling caught their attention. The dust near the door had been disturbed. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest movement. A faint shoe mark that hadn't been there before. A subtle shift in one of the boxes they were certain they hadn't touched. There was no proof anyone had entered. But doubt had already taken root. They checked the containers again. Still sealed. Still heavy. Still there. Yet the atmosphere had changed once more, now layered with suspicion. Awareness that unknown variables existed beyond their control. In that moment, both understood something fundamental about discoveries like this. The value of what you find is only one part of the equation. The context matters more. Because sometimes the true weight of a discovery isn't measured in money, it's measured in consequences. They closed the unit for what they believed might be the last time. Walking away down the corridor, the metallic echoes of their footsteps blending with the hum of fluorescent lights, they carried the same final realization. Treasure isn't always a reward. Sometimes it's a responsibility you never asked for. Weeks passed. No phone calls, no letters, no sudden confrontations in the parking lot. On the surface, nothing happened. And yet the psychological pressure didn't disappear. It evolved. The human mind struggles with unresolved situations more than with clear danger. Uncertainty becomes its own form of tension. They replayed possibilities constantly. Maybe the tracker was inactive. Maybe whoever owned it had abandoned the containers intentionally. Maybe no one would ever come. But maybe is never comfortable. One evening they decided to go back again, not to search, not to inventory, but simply to confirm everything was unchanged. The facility was quiet, the sky already dark, security lights casting long shadows between rows of units. When they reached the door, something immediately felt wrong. The lock. It wasn't theirs. Same model, same color, but not the same lock. For a few seconds, neither of them reacted. The brain sometimes delays recognition when reality contradicts expectation. Then the realization settled in like cold water down the spine. Someone had been there. They looked at each other, both understanding the implication without speaking. Slowly, they cut the lock. The metal door rolled upward with its usual mechanical rattle echoing down the corridor. Inside, the layout was almost identical. Almost. One of the containers was missing. The remaining two were still in place, but shifted slightly. A chair that had been near the entrance was now pushed against the wall. Small changes, but undeniable. Whoever had entered knew exactly what they were looking for, and had taken only part of it. There were no notes, no threats, no signs of forced entry beyond the replaced lock. Just absence, a silent confirmation that the containers had never truly been abandoned. For several seconds they stood frozen, processing what that meant. The story wasn't over. It had simply continued without them. A strange mixture of relief and dread washed over both of them at the same time. Relief that someone else had reclaimed at least part of whatever had been hidden. Dread because it proved the situation had always involved unknown actors. They didn't open the remaining containers that night. They didn't touch anything. They closed the door again, secured it, and walked away, without speaking. Because the final truth had become undeniable. Some storage units don't contain lost property. They contain chapters of lives that were never meant to intersect with yours. And sometimes, the safest discovery is the one you choose not to keep. For a long time after that night, neither of them spoke about the container. Not because they had agreed to stay silent, but because the experience had moved beyond the point where words felt useful. Some events settle into the mind, not as stories, but as sensations. The echo of metal doors, the smell of dust and plastic, the unnatural heaviness of sealed containers that carried more meaning than their weight alone. Life resumed its outward rhythm, work schedules, bills, conversations about ordinary things. Yet beneath that surface, a quiet awareness remained, like a background frequency that never fully faded. They both knew the situation was unfinished. Eventually, curiosity, or perhaps the need for closure, pulled them back one more time. It was late afternoon when they arrived at the facility again. The sky was overcast, light diffused into a dull gray that flattened shadows and made everything feel strangely muted. The long corridor of storage units looked exactly the same as always. Rows of identical metal doors stretching into distance, each one hiding unknown fragments of someone's past. Their footsteps echoed as they approached the unit. The lock was still theirs this time, no visible disturbance. And yet the memory of the replaced lock from before lingered in their minds, sharpening every observation. When the door finally rolled open, the interior seemed almost staged in its stillness. Furniture unmoved, dust patterns undisturbed, containers resting where they had been left. 2 containers remained. The absence of the third still felt like a physical presence, a negative space that drew the eye immediately. They stepped inside slowly. Neither of them rushed anymore. The urgency from the first discovery was gone, replaced by a deliberate, almost cautious attention. They noticed details they had overlooked before, faint scuff marks on the concrete, subtle differences in dust accumulation, the smell, less of mold now, more of plastic and old paper. One of them knelt near the remaining containers and ran a hand along the lid, feeling the rough, adhesive residue where layers of tape overlapped. The tracker they had found earlier was still attached, inert and silent, but its presence continued to symbolize something larger: intention. Someone had placed these items here with a plan, and that plan had intersected unexpectedly with their lives. They opened one container again. The contents were unchanged, vacuum-sealed bundles stacked with mechanical precision, edges aligned, surfaces compressed into solid rectangular forms. The sight no longer triggered adrenaline. Instead, it produced a strange detachment, as if they were observing objects in a museum display, rather than something that had once promised life-altering opportunity. At the bottom, the documents remained. Photographs, handwritten notes, dates spanning years. They studied them more carefully this time, not searching for value but for understanding. Patterns emerged, recurring locations, repeated numbers, annotations that suggested coordination rather than randomness. It hinted at movement over time, decisions made across months or years, actions connected to people they would never know. The realization deepened. Every object inside that container was part of a narrative already in progress long before they arrived. They were never the main characters, just accidental witnesses. As the hours passed, the emotional weight shifted again, away from tension toward reflection. What had begun as excitement had transformed into something quieter, more philosophical. The container represented not just risk or mystery, but the fragile boundary between lives. How easily circumstances could intersect strangers. How hidden systems could exist parallel to ordinary routines without notice. Before leaving, they closed the container carefully, almost respectfully, aligning the lid exactly as it had been before. The metal door rolled down with its familiar grinding resonance, sealing the space once more. Walking away through the corridor, they felt neither triumph nor regret, only perspective. Because the experience had revealed something most people never encounter. Not all discoveries are meant to change your life. Some are meant to show you how many unseen stories exist around you, layered, complex, and moving independently of your own. And once you understand that, the world never feels quite as simple again. Months passed before they returned again, not because they wanted to, but because unfinished experiences have a way of lingering in the mind, resurfacing in quiet moments when attention drifts. A memory triggered by something small, the metallic smell of a tool, the hollow echo inside a garage, the sight of sealed plastic packaging in an unrelated store. The container had become more than an event. It had become a question without an answer. When they finally drove back to the facility, the season had changed. The air was colder, sharper, carrying that dry stillness that comes before winter. The rows of storage buildings looked identical to before, but time had subtly altered the surroundings. Faded paint, scattered leaves caught in corners, small signs of neglect that only appeared after months had passed. The unit was still registered in their name, still theirs, at least legally. They walked down the corridor slowly, footsteps echoing against concrete walls. The familiarity of the space felt strange now, like returning to a place where something significant had happened long ago. The lock opened with a mechanical click. When the door rolled upward, the interior greeted them with silence. Dust had settled thicker across surfaces. A faint smell of cold air mixed with plastic and paper. Nothing appeared disturbed. The two remaining containers sat exactly where they had been left months earlier, their dark surfaces absorbing the dim light from the corridor. For a moment, neither of them stepped inside, because the psychological distance between then and now was enormous. Back during the first discovery, everything had felt immediate: adrenaline, confusion, excitement, fear. Now there was only curiosity, tempered by experience. They entered slowly. One of them noticed something new almost immediately: condensation marks along the inside wall. Water had seeped under the door at some point during the months, leaving faint mineral trails on the concrete. The containers themselves were untouched, but the environment had changed just enough to remind them of time's passage. Time had moved forward. Whatever story these objects belonged to had also moved forward somewhere else. They opened one container again, almost ceremonially. The bundles remained perfectly intact. Vacuum seals unbroken. The same compressed geometry of stacked currency. The same documents at the bottom, photographs, notes, names that meant nothing to them but clearly meant everything to someone else. Yet something inside them had shifted. The money no longer represented possibility. It represented context. Unknown origins, unknown consequences, unknown endings. They sat on the edge of an old chair inside the unit, silent for a while, letting the weight of the moment settle. Outside, distant sounds echoed: a car door closing somewhere, footsteps passing in another corridor, the ordinary noises of people interacting with their own stored belongings. Lives continuing, parallel stories. Eventually, one of them spoke quietly, more to himself than to the other. This was never ours. It wasn't a legal statement. It was philosophical. An acknowledgement that discovery doesn't equal ownership in a deeper sense, that objects carry histories, intentions, trajectories independent of whoever happens to encounter them temporarily. They closed the container again, carefully, as if preserving something fragile, even though nothing about it was physically delicate. When the metal door rolled down for what would become the last time, the sound echoed longer than usual, reverberating through the corridor, before fading into silence. Walking away, they felt something unexpected: relief. Not because the situation was resolved, but because they finally understood it. The container had never been about money. It had been about perspective, about the hidden complexity that exists beneath ordinary surfaces, about how easily lives intersect without warning, about the realization that some doors, once opened, reveal more than you ever intended to see. And sometimes the most valuable thing you take away is the understanding that not every discovery is meant to be kept. Years passed. The storage facility changed ownership twice. New security cameras appeared along the corridors. Fresh paint covered the aging metal doors, and updated electronic gate systems replaced the old keypad entry. To anyone visiting for the first time, it was just another rental complex. Anonymous, functional, forgettable. But for them, the place had never returned to being ordinary. Memory has a peculiar architecture. Certain experiences don't fade with time. Instead, they settle deeper, becoming quieter, but more permanent. The container had long since been emptied. the remaining items transferred through processes they no longer spoke about, yet the psychological imprint remained intact. Occasionally, one of them would drive past the facility without stopping. Not intentionally, just passing through. And every time the same sensation surfaced, a brief tightening in the chest, a flash of images, the heavy lids, the silent stacks of sealed bundles, the documents that had transformed excitement into awareness. It wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. Because the experience had revealed something fundamental about the world. How much exists beyond what we see? How many parallel narratives unfold around us without notice? How easily chance can place someone at the intersection of events they were never meant to encounter. One evening, years later, they met again over coffee. The conversation wandered through familiar territory. Work, family, ordinary life, milestones. Eventually, as conversations sometimes do, it drifted back to the container. For a moment, neither spoke. Then one of them smiled slightly and said, "Do you ever think about it?" The other nodded. Not constantly, but enough. What struck them most in retrospect wasn't the money, the mystery, or even the uncertainty. It was the psychological transition, the way human perception can flip in seconds, how something that looks like opportunity can become responsibility, how excitement can dissolve into caution when context changes. They had entered that unit expecting objects. They had left with perspective. Over time, they came to understand the deeper lesson. Discovery is rarely about what you find. It's about what the finding reveals. About systems, about people, about yourself. Because the container had forced them to confront questions most people never face. What does ownership really mean? Where does responsibility begin? How do you react when luck places you inside someone else's unfinished story? There were no definitive answers, only understanding. And that understanding carried forward into everything else: decisions, risks, judgments, even the way they viewed strangers. The world no longer appeared as a collection of isolated events, but as overlapping layers of hidden causes and consequences. Long after the container was gone, its impact remained, not as a memory of treasure, but as a reminder. Behind every closed door exists a story already in motion, and sometimes opening it changes you more than anything inside ever could. Time continued its quiet, relentless movement. What had once felt like a singular, almost surreal episode gradually became woven into the larger fabric of their lives, not fading, but integrating. Memory transformed the sharp edges of the experience into something smoother, more contemplative, yet no less significant. They both noticed subtle changes in themselves over the years. Risk no longer looked the same. Opportunities were evaluated differently. Even chance encounters carried a faint awareness that unseen layers might exist beneath ordinary appearances. A locked door, a sealed package, a casual transaction, each held the potential for complexity that most people never considered. The container had recalibrated their perception. One autumn afternoon, nearly a decade after the original discovery, one of them decided to visit the facility again, not out of necessity, but out of a quiet impulse that had resurfaced without warning. The air carried that familiar seasonal chill, dry leaves scraping across asphalt in small spirals of wind. The buildings looked newer now, renovated, repainted, updated with modern signage. Standing there, it was almost difficult to reconcile the present environment with the memory of what had happened years earlier. He walked slowly along the rows of units, fingers brushing lightly against the corrugated metal surfaces as he passed. Each door represented unknown contents, unknown circumstances, fragments of lives paused in storage. The realization struck him with unusual clarity. At any given moment, thousands of hidden narratives exist in places people consider mundane. Unpaid debts, sudden relocations, lost inheritances, business failures, personal tragedies, intentional concealments, forgotten possessions, emergency decisions made under pressure. Storage units were not just spaces. They were intersections of human stories and time. He stopped near the approximate location of the old unit. The number had changed under the new ownership system, but spatial memory is powerful. He could still sense where it had been. Standing there, he closed his eyes briefly, allowing the memory to surface fully one more time. The heavy lid lifting, the silent stacks, the shift from disbelief to awareness. What surprised him most was not the emotional intensity, but the gratitude that accompanied it now. Not gratitude for the discovery itself, but for the perspective it had provided. Because over the years he had come to understand something deeper. The container had exposed the illusion of simplicity. People often imagine life as linear, actions leading to predictable results, opportunities clearly defined, outcomes tied directly to effort. But reality operates through networks of cause and effect far more complex than that. Chance, timing, hidden variables, other people's decisions, all intertwine continuously. That storage unit had been one small node in a vast web. They had touched it briefly, then moved on. Yet the awareness remained. Later that evening, he wrote a short note to his former partner from those days. Not about money, or mystery, or unresolved questions, but about the realization that had lingered longest. "Do you remember," he wrote, "how fast everything changed when we understood what we were looking at? I think that moment taught me more than anything else in my life. Not about luck, about perspective." The reply came hours later. Yes, it showed us how much we don't see. And that was the essence of it. The container had never truly been about hidden wealth, missing owners, or unexplained circumstances. Those were surface elements, dramatic, memorable, but secondary. The real discovery had been cognitive, an awakening to the layered nature of reality. Years later, both of them still carried that awareness forward, in decisions, in caution, in empathy toward strangers whose stories might be far more complicated than they appeared. Because once you witness how easily ordinary situations can conceal extraordinary depth, you stop assuming anything is simple, and the world becomes simultaneously more uncertain and more meaningful than it ever seemed before. The final understanding came not in a dramatic moment, but quietly, the way most profound realizations arrive. Years after everything had happened, the memory no longer carried tension. There was no lingering fear, no unanswered urgency, no need to interpret what the containers had meant or where the story had gone afterward. Because life had continued, careers evolved, relationships changed, new challenges appeared and disappeared. Time layered new experiences over old ones until the storage unit became just one chapter among many. And yet, it never fully disappeared. One evening, standing alone in his garage while organizing tools, he noticed a sealed plastic box on a shelf. Something ordinary he had stored months earlier. For a brief second, the sensation returned. That old awareness. That subtle shift in perception. He realized then what the container had ultimately given him. Not mystery, not opportunity, perspective. The experience had permanently altered how he saw the world. It had revealed how thin the boundary is between normal life and hidden complexity. How easily circumstances can place someone at the edge of events they never intended to encounter. How chance can expose layers of reality most people never notice. But more importantly, it had shown him something about himself. In the beginning, he had reacted like anyone would: excitement, disbelief, adrenaline. The promise of sudden change had overwhelmed reason for a moment. But what followed had mattered more: restraint, reflection, the ability to step back and recognize that not everything valuable is meant to be taken. Some discoveries are tests, not of luck, of character. He closed the plastic box in his garage and placed it back on the shelf. The small click of the lid echoed softly in the quiet space, strangely similar to the sound of those containers years ago. For the first time, he felt complete closure, because he understood now. The storage unit had never been a turning point in his life. It had been a mirror, a brief intersection with a hidden story that revealed how much exists beyond what we control, beyond what we expect, beyond what we think we understand. And once you see that, you carry it forever, not as a memory of what you found, but as awareness of how much remains unseen.